The mahogany table trembled as Principal Harrison's fist came down with force that echoed through the packed boardroom. His voice boomed across the sea of concerned parents and faculty members, but his target was singular and precise. The woman, sitting quietly in the third row, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, her weathered hands folded peacefully on her lap. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen had been teaching for 37 years, and in all that time, she had never once raised her voice in anger at a colleague. Tonight, that streak would end in ways no one in Riverside Elementary's boardroom could have imagined. Margaret's story began 3 decades before that explosive board meeting in a small dojo in San Francisco's Chinatown, where a young woman named Maggie Liu first learned that strength came not from size or volume, but from discipline and purpose. She was 22 then, fresh out of college, with a teaching degree and a heart full of idealism about changing young lives. The dojo had been her sanctuary during those early years when classroom management felt impossible, and veteran teachers looked at her with skepticism that bordered on condescension. Master Chen had been in his 70s when she first bowed to him on that scarred wooden floor. His English was limited, but his lessons transcended language. He taught her that teaching and martial arts shared the same foundation: patience, persistence, and the wisdom to know when gentleness served better than force. Under his guidance, she spent 15 years learning not just the physical techniques of traditional kung fu, but the mental discipline that separated true martial artists from mere fighters. She earned her black sash at 35, the same year she married David Chen, Master Chen's nephew and fellow teacher at Riverside Elementary. The name change from Liu to Chen felt like destiny rather than coincidence. She kept her martial arts training quiet, not from shame, but because she understood that true strength often worked best when hidden. In the classroom, she needed patience and creativity more than physical prowess. Her students responded to her calm authority, her ability to diffuse conflicts with a word or gesture, her uncanny knack for seeing through teenage bravado to the insecurity beneath. Margaret built her reputation slowly and deliberately. While other teachers burned out or transferred to easier districts, she remained at Lincoln Elementary, watching neighborhoods change around her, adapting her methods to serve each new generation of students. She taught 3rd grade for 15 years, then moved to 5th grade when the district needed someone who could handle the more challenging pre-teen dynamics. Her classroom became a refuge for kids who struggled elsewhere, the place difficult students somehow transformed into scholars and leaders. The secret to Margaret's success lay not in any single technique, but in her ability to see patterns others missed. Years of martial arts training had taught her to read body language, to recognize the subtle shifts in energy that preceded conflicts. She could spot a playground bully from across the yard, identify the signs of trouble at home in a child's posture, diffuse tensions before they exploded into violence. Her colleagues called it intuition. Margaret knew it was training. She never spoke about her black sash, never mentioned the tournaments she'd won in her 30s, never revealed that she still practiced forms in her backyard every morning at dawn. To her students and fellow teachers, she was simply Mrs. Chen, the woman who somehow made even the most difficult children want to learn. Her personnel file contained commendations from 5 different principals, thank you letters from hundreds of parents, and achievement test scores that consistently ranked among the district's highest. The trouble began when Riverside Elementary got its new principal. Harrison Wade arrived from the state capital with a mandate to shake up what the district office considered an underperforming school. At 45, he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve through intimidation and authority. His resume boasted of turning around 3 struggling schools, though it failed to mention the veteran teachers who had transferred out rather than endure his management style. Harrison's first faculty meeting set the tone for what would become a year-long campaign of harassment disguised as reform. He strode into the staff room that August afternoon, his tailored suit and expensive watch announcing his arrival before he spoke a word. The teachers assembled around the long tables fell silent, sensing the change in atmosphere that accompanies the arrival of predators. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to compliance, "I've been brought here to fix what's broken. And from what I can see in your test scores, your discipline reports, and your general atmosphere, plenty needs fixing." His eyes swept the room, cataloguing potential opposition. They lingered on Margaret, who sat quietly in her usual spot near the back, her expression neutral but attentive. Harrison had done his homework. He knew Margaret's reputation, her longevity, her influence with both students and parents. In his experience, veteran teachers like her represented the biggest obstacle to the kind of dramatic changes that made administrators' careers. They had relationships that took years to build, institutional knowledge that made them valuable, and tenure protections that made them difficult to remove. Her posture straightened, her movements became more deliberate, and her eyes held a focus that suggested she was preparing for something beyond another day of Harrison's harassment. Margaret began documenting everything, every criticism, every unreasonable demand. Every public humiliation was carefully recorded, with dates, times, and witnesses. She photographed her original lesson plans before making Harrison's required revisions, keeping evidence of teaching methods that had been praised for decades. She saved emails that showed the impossibly contradictory nature of his demands, the way he would criticize her for being too strict one week and too lenient the next. More importantly, she began building alliances, not the kind of political coalition that might challenge Harrison directly, but something more fundamental, relationships with parents and community members who understood her value. She quietly reached out to families whose children she had taught over the years, former students who had gone on to successful careers, colleagues who had transferred to other schools but maintained their respect for her dedication. Margaret understood that Harrison's attack on her was really an attack on the values that had made Lincoln Elementary a place where learning thrived despite economic challenges and social obstacles. His vision of education emphasized test scores over understanding, compliance over creativity, fear over respect. She had seen this approach destroy schools before, watched as dedicated teachers were replaced by easily controlled newcomers who taught to tests rather than children. The parent community began to notice the changes at Lincoln Elementary. Children who had always loved school started expressing reluctance about going to class. Test scores, ironically, began to decline despite Harrison's focus on standardized assessments. The warm, welcoming atmosphere that had characterized the school for decades was replaced by an institutional coldness that made everyone uncomfortable. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose 3 children had been in Margaret's classes over the past 8 years, was among the first to speak up. She had immigrated to the United States with limited English and a fierce determination to give her children better opportunities than she had known. Margaret had been instrumental in helping all 3 children not just succeed academically, but develop the confidence and critical thinking skills that would serve them throughout their lives. "Something is wrong at that school," Mrs. Rodriguez told her husband after their youngest daughter came home in tears for the 3rd time that month. "Sophia says Mrs. Chen looks sad all the time now, and the principal keeps interrupting her lessons to tell her she's doing things wrong. But Mrs. Chen taught Miguel and Carmen, and they both got into the gifted program because of her. How can she suddenly be doing everything wrong?" Similar conversations were happening in households throughout the Lincoln Elementary attendance zone. Parents who had specifically requested Margaret's classroom for their children were questioning whether the school still provided the nurturing environment they had come to expect. Some began exploring private school options or considering transfers to other districts, actions that would ultimately harm the very students Margaret was trying to protect. Harrison seemed oblivious to the growing discontent among parents and teachers. His focus remained fixed on Margaret, whose quiet dignity in the face of his harassment apparently offended his sense of administrative authority. He interpreted her refusal to fight back as evidence that he was winning, that she would eventually resign or transfer rather than continue enduring his systematic campaign of professional destruction. What Harrison failed to understand was that Margaret's apparent passivity masked a strategic patience, learned through decades of dealing with difficult personalities. She had taught children who threw tantrums, parents who blamed teachers for their own failures, and administrators who prioritized politics over education. She had learned that rushing to confront bullies often gave them exactly what they wanted: drama, chaos, and the opportunity to claim victimhood when their targets finally snapped. Instead, Margaret was building a case, not just for her own protection, but for the protection of every teacher who would come after her, every student who deserved better than Harrison's authoritarian approach to education. She understood that individual resistance was often futile, but collective action could move mountains. The question was finding the right moment and the right forum to make her stand. The opportunity came in the form of a mandatory school board meeting called to address what Harrison had carefully framed as personnel issues requiring administrative support. He had convinced the board that certain long-tenured teachers were resistant to necessary reforms, that their influence over younger faculty was undermining his efforts to improve educational outcomes. He requested permission to implement more aggressive supervision protocols and easier pathways for removing underperforming educators. Margaret knew this meeting was really about her. Harrison had grown frustrated with his inability to provoke her into the kind of public outburst that would justify disciplinary action. Her careful documentation of his harassment had made it difficult for him to build a case for incompetence or insubordination. So he was escalating to the school board level, seeking institutional backing for what amounted to a campaign of professional assassination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her posture straightened, her movements became more deliberate, and her eyes held a focus that suggested she was preparing for something beyond another day of Harrison's harassment. Margaret began documenting everything, every criticism, every unreasonable demand. Every public humiliation was carefully recorded, with dates, times, and witnesses. She photographed her original lesson plans before making Harrison's required revisions, keeping evidence of teaching methods that had been praised for decades. She saved emails that showed the impossibly contradictory nature of his demands, the way he would criticize her for being too strict one week and too lenient the next. More importantly, she began building alliances, not the kind of political coalition that might challenge Harrison directly, but something more fundamental: relationships with parents and community members who understood her value. She quietly reached out to families whose children she had taught over the years, former students who had gone on to successful careers, colleagues who had transferred to other schools but maintained their respect for her dedication. Margaret understood that Harrison's attack on her was really an attack on the values that had made Lincoln Elementary a place where learning thrived despite economic challenges and social obstacles. His vision of education emphasized test scores over understanding, compliance over creativity, fear over respect. She had seen this approach destroy schools before, watched as dedicated teachers were replaced by easily controlled newcomers who taught to tests rather than children. The parent community began to notice the changes at Lincoln Elementary. Children who had always loved school started expressing reluctance about going to class. Test scores, ironically, began to decline despite Harrison's focus on standardized assessments. The warm, welcoming atmosphere that had characterized the school for decades was replaced by an institutional coldness that made everyone uncomfortable. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose 3 children had been in Margaret's classes over the past 8 years, was among the first to speak up. She had immigrated to the United States with limited English and a fierce determination to give her children better opportunities than she had known. Margaret had been instrumental in helping all 3 children not just succeed academically, but develop the confidence and critical thinking skills that would serve them throughout their lives. "Something is wrong at that school," Mrs. Rodriguez told her husband after their youngest daughter came home in tears for the 3rd time that month. "Sophia says Mrs. Chen looks sad all the time now, and the principal keeps interrupting her lessons to tell her she's doing things wrong. But Mrs. Chen taught Miguel and Carmen, and they both got into the gifted program because of her. How can she suddenly be doing everything wrong?" Similar conversations were happening in households throughout the Lincoln Elementary attendance zone. Parents who had specifically requested Margaret's classroom for their children were questioning whether the school still provided the nurturing environment they had come to expect. Some began exploring private school options or considering transfers to other districts, actions that would ultimately harm the very students Margaret was trying to protect. Harrison seemed oblivious to the growing discontent among parents and teachers. His focus remained fixed on Margaret, whose quiet dignity in the face of his harassment apparently offended his sense of administrative authority. He interpreted her refusal to fight back as evidence that he was winning, that she would eventually resign or transfer rather than continue enduring his systematic campaign of professional destruction. What Harrison failed to understand was that Margaret's apparent passivity masked a strategic patience, learned through decades of dealing with difficult personalities. She had taught children who threw tantrums, parents who blamed teachers for their own failures, and administrators who prioritized politics over education. She had learned that rushing to confront bullies often gave them exactly what they wanted: drama, chaos, and the opportunity to claim victimhood when their targets finally snapped. Instead, Margaret was building a case, not just for her own protection, but for the protection of every teacher who would come after her, every student who deserved better than Harrison's authoritarian approach to education. She understood that individual resistance was often futile, but collective action could move mountains. The question was finding the right moment and the right forum to make her stand. The opportunity came in the form of a mandatory school board meeting called to address what Harrison had carefully framed as personnel issues requiring administrative support. He had convinced the board that certain long-tenured teachers were resistant to necessary reforms, that their influence over younger faculty was undermining his efforts to improve educational outcomes. He requested permission to implement more aggressive supervision protocols and easier pathways for removing underperforming educators. Margaret knew this meeting was really about her. Harrison had grown frustrated with his inability to provoke her into the kind of public outburst that would justify disciplinary action. Her careful documentation of his harassment had made it difficult for him to build a case for incompetence or insubordination. So he was escalating to the school board level, seeking institutional backing for what amounted to a campaign of professional assassination. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in March, when the school board typically handled personnel issues away from the public attention that regular board meetings attracted. Harrison had not counted on Margaret's network of relationships within the community, or her understanding that transparency was often the best weapon against institutional bullying. Word of the meeting spread quietly through the parent community. Mrs. Rodriguez made phone calls to other families whose children had benefited from Margaret's teaching. Former students, now adults with children of their own, heard about the situation through social media posts that carefully avoided naming names while making clear that a beloved teacher was under attack. Colleagues from other schools, teachers who had worked with Margaret over the years and respected her dedication, began planning to attend in support. Harrison arrived at the school board meeting confident in his narrative and his authority. He had prepared a presentation highlighting declining test scores, discipline issues, and what he characterized as resistance to necessary reforms. His slides contained carefully selected data that supported his case, while ignoring context and broader trends. He had secured the backing of the district office, whose administrators valued his reputation for making tough decisions and implementing unpopular but necessary changes. What he found in the boardroom that evening was not the sparsely attended personnel meeting he had expected, but a packed room of parents, teachers, and community members who had come to hear what charges were being brought against one of Lincoln Elementary's most respected educators. The air was thick with tension and anticipation, the kind of atmosphere that precedes either triumph or disaster. Margaret sat in her usual quiet manner, but those who knew her well could see the difference. Her posture held the kind of relaxed readiness that martial artists cultivate, the ability to appear calm while remaining prepared for sudden action. Her hands rested peacefully in her lap, but her eyes held a focus that suggested she was seeing everything, measuring distances, calculating angles of attack and defense. Harrison took his place at the podium, his presentation materials arranged. With military precision, his confidence radiating through the packed room. He looked out at the audience with the satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the advantages, who had carefully orchestrated this moment to achieve maximum impact with minimum resistance. He began his presentation with the smooth professionalism that had carried him through dozens of similar confrontations. His voice was measured, his tone reasonable, his arguments structured to appeal to board members who valued efficiency over sentiment. He spoke of accountability and progress, of the need to move beyond outdated methods that served neither students nor taxpayers. But as Harrison spoke, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Parents who had come prepared to listen found themselves growing angry as they realized the target of his carefully veiled criticism. Teachers who had worked with Margaret for years recognized the distorted picture being painted of their colleague and friend. Board members, some of whom had children in Margaret's classes over the years, began to question the narrative they were hearing. Margaret remained silent through the first part of Harrison's presentation, but her stillness was not the passivity he had grown accustomed to seeing. It was the kind of focused calm that preceded action, the gathering of energy that martial artists learn to recognize in themselves and others. Around her, the room's energy was building toward something explosive, and she was beginning to understand that her moment had finally arrived. The confrontation that would follow would transform not just Margaret's career, but her understanding of when patience becomes complicity, when silence enables evil, and when the time for restraint has finally ended. Harrison had mistaken her. Years of professional courtesy for weakness, her commitment to peaceful resolution for inability to fight back. He was about to learn the difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to do so. As Harrison continued his presentation, attacking not just Margaret's methods, but her character, her dedication, and her impact on the children she had served for nearly 4 decades, something ancient and powerful began to stir within her. Not rage, which would have been uncontrolled and therefore useless, but the kind of righteous anger that had motivated warriors and teachers throughout history when they finally decided that enough was enough. The veteran teacher who had spent 37 years nurturing young minds, who had earned her black sash through 15 years of disciplined training, who had faced down playground bullies and administrative tyrants with equal measure of patience and strength, was about to remind everyone in that boardroom that true power often came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Harrison Wade had made the mistake that bullies throughout history had made when confronting those they perceived as weak. He had confused kindness with cowardice, mistaken patience for powerlessness, and assumed that someone who chose not to fight was someone who could not fight. In the next few minutes, he would receive an education that no administrative training program could have prepared him for, delivered by a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest service you could provide was to stand up and say no more. The transformation was beginning, subtle but unmistakable, to those who knew what to look for. Margaret's breathing deepened and slowed, her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and her eyes took on the kind of focus that came from decades of training in the art of controlled violence. She was still the gentle teacher who had guided thousands of children toward better futures, but she was also something else. Something Harrison was about to discover had been hiding beneath the surface all along. The packed boardroom held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen, though few could have predicted the precise nature of the storm that was gathering. In the space of a few minutes, everything would change, not just for Margaret and Harrison, but for everyone who believed they understood the relationship between power and authority, between strength and position, between those who led through fear and those who taught through love. Margaret Chen was about to give the most important lesson of her career, and her students this time would include not just the board members and administrators who had forgotten why schools existed, but everyone who had ever wondered whether good people could stand up to institutional bullying and win. The answer was about to unfold before their eyes, delivered with the precision and power that came from a lifetime of preparation meeting its perfect moment. The silence in the room was pregnant with possibility, the kind of quiet that precedes thunder, and Margaret was ready to break it in ways that would echo through the district for years to come. Harrison had pushed too far, attacked too much, and underestimated too greatly the woman he thought he could destroy through bureaucratic harassment and professional intimidation. The lesson was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. The projector screen displayed Harrison's carefully crafted slideshow, each bullet point a calculated assault on Margaret's 3 decades of dedication to education. He clicked through statistics that painted Lincoln Elementary as a failing institution, test scores that had been manipulated to support his narrative, and discipline reports that ignored the socio-economic challenges facing the school's student population. His voice carried the authoritative tone of someone who had delivered similar presentations to school boards across 3 different districts, each time successfully removing veteran teachers who stood in the way of his aggressive reform agenda. As you can see from slide 14, Harrison continued, his laser pointer dancing across fabricated data, certain instructional approaches that may have been acceptable in previous decades are simply not meeting the rigorous standards our students deserve in today's competitive educational environment. The slide showed standardized test scores from Margaret's 5th grade class, but the numbers had been selectively chosen from a particularly challenging year when the school had received an influx of refugee children with limited English proficiency. Board member Patricia Williams shifted uncomfortably in her seat, recognizing the manipulation even if she couldn't immediately identify its source. Her own daughter had been in Margaret's class 7 years earlier, struggling with severe dyslexia that other teachers had dismissed as simple laziness. Margaret had spent countless after-school hours working with the child, developing specialized techniques that ultimately helped her not only catch up to grade level, but excel beyond it. The woman Harrison was describing bore no resemblance to the dedicated educator who had transformed her daughter's academic trajectory. Harrison advanced to his next slide, this one showing what he claimed were examples of outdated teaching methods that failed to align with current educational research. The room's temperature seemed to rise as parents recognized activities their children had described with enthusiasm, innovative approaches that had made learning feel like adventure rather than drudgery. Mrs. Patterson, whose son had autism and had flourished under Margaret's patient guidance, felt her jaw clench as Harrison dismissed individualized instruction as inefficient resource allocation. Margaret remained motionless throughout Harrison's presentation, but those seated near her could sense the change in her energy. Her breathing had become deeper and more controlled, the kind of rhythmic pattern she had learned during her early training with Master Chen. Her hands, still folded peacefully in her lap, showed no visible tension, but her wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as her fingers moved in subtle exercises that helped maintain circulation and readiness. The presentation continued for nearly 20 minutes, each slide building Harrison's case for what he termed necessary personnel adjustments to improve educational outcomes. He spoke in the coded language of administrative bureaucracy, never mentioning Margaret by name, but making his target unmistakably clear to everyone in the room. He referenced resistance to innovative methodologies, failure to embrace data-driven instruction, and unwillingness to participate in collaborative professional development opportunities. As Harrison spoke, Margaret's mind traveled back to a conversation she had shared with Master Chen during her final year of training. They had been discussing the philosophy of Wu Wei, the concept of acting in accordance with natural flow rather than forcing outcomes through brute effort. The old master had smiled at her questions about when action became necessary, when the principle of non-interference gave way to the obligation to intervene. "Student asks good question," Master Chen had said in his careful English, his weathered hands demonstrating a defensive sequence as he spoke. "Tree bends in wind because flexible survives storm. But when wind tries to uproot tree completely, when threatens to destroy what took many years to grow, then tree must use deep roots, must resist with full strength. Wise person knows difference between wind that tests and wind that destroys." Margaret understood now that Harrison represented the second type of wind. His attacks on her teaching methods were really attacks on everything she had built over decades of service, every relationship she had forged with struggling students, every innovation she had developed to reach children others had written off as unteachable. He wasn't trying to improve education, but to remake it in his own image, replacing creativity with conformity, replacing wisdom with data points, replacing love with fear. The slideshow reached its climax with Harrison's recommendations. For moving forward, he proposed implementing intensive supervision protocols for teachers who showed resistance to his reforms, establishing clear metrics for measuring compliance with district initiatives, and creating expedited pathways for removing educators who failed to demonstrate adequate flexibility in adopting new methodologies. The language was clinical and professional, but the intent was unmistakable: submit completely or face elimination. "The research is clear," Harrison concluded, his voice taking on the fervent tone of someone who believed his own propaganda, "that student achievement improves dramatically when instructional staff embrace evidence-based practices under strong administrative leadership. We have an opportunity here to transform Lincoln Elementary into a model for the entire district, but only if we have the courage to make difficult decisions about personnel who may have served admirably in the past, but lack the skills necessary for 21st century education." Board Chairwoman Dr. Sandra Mitchell thanked Harrison for his comprehensive presentation and opened the floor for questions. The room erupted in a forest of raised hands as parents, teachers, and community members sought recognition to speak. The energy was electric, charged with anger and disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Dr. Mitchell, a retired educator herself, seemed overwhelmed by the response, clearly unprepared for the level of community engagement Harrison's presentation had generated. "I'd like to hear from the teacher in question," announced board member James Crawford, a local businessman whose construction company had donated materials for playground improvements Margaret had organized 5 years earlier. "It seems only fair that someone facing such serious accusations should have an opportunity to respond before we consider any personnel actions." Harrison's face flushed red at this suggestion. His carefully orchestrated presentation was supposed to lead to a quick board vote authorizing expanded administrative powers, not a public hearing where his target might mount a defense. He stepped forward to the microphone, his composure cracking slightly under the unexpected resistance. "With all due respect, Mr. Crawford," Harrison said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation masked as professional concern, "personnel matters of this nature are typically handled through appropriate administrative channels rather than public forums. The individual in question has had multiple opportunities to address these performance issues through our established supervision process." Margaret stood slowly, her movement fluid and controlled, despite the tension that filled the room. She had not spoken during any board meeting in her 37 years at Lincoln Elementary, preferring to let her classroom results speak for themselves. But something had shifted inside her during Harrison's presentation, something that demanded acknowledgement and response. The assembled crowd fell silent as she moved toward the front of the room, her presence commanding attention despite her modest stature and unassuming appearance. "Dr. Mitchell," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed boardroom without strain or artifice, "I would appreciate the opportunity to address the allegations that have been made against my teaching methods and professional conduct." The room's atmosphere changed dramatically as Margaret took her position at the podium. Parents who had known her for years saw something different in her bearing, a quality they had never observed during parent conferences or school events. Teachers who had worked alongside her for decades recognized the transformation, but couldn't quite identify its source. Even Harrison seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though his arrogance prevented him from understanding the true nature of what was unfolding. Margaret looked out at the crowd, her eyes moving systematically across familiar faces before settling on Harrison, who had taken a seat in the front row with an expression of smug confidence. She understood that this moment would define not just her own career, but the future of education at Lincoln Elementary and potentially throughout the district. The choice she made in the next few minutes would determine whether Harrison's vision of authoritarian control would prevail or whether the values of compassionate, individualized instruction would survive his assault. 37 years ago, Margaret began, her voice steady and clear, I walked into my first classroom with a head full of educational theory and a heart full of hope. I believed then, as I believe now, that teaching is not about forcing knowledge into unwilling minds, but about nurturing the natural curiosity that exists in every child. Over the decades, I have had the privilege of working with thousands of students, each one unique, each one deserving of respect and individual attention. She paused, letting her words settle over the room before continuing. Principal Wade has presented statistics and data points that he claims demonstrate my inadequacy as an educator. I would like to present some different data for your consideration. Margaret reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that she had assembled over the past several weeks, anticipating that this confrontation would eventually become necessary. Jennifer Martinez, class of 2008, Margaret read from. Her notes struggled with severe reading comprehension difficulties that previous teachers had attributed to learning disabilities. through individualized instruction and creative teaching methods that Principal Wade would apparently classify as outdated. Jennifer not only caught up to grade level, but went on to earn a master's degree in education. She now teaches at Riverside Elementary, where she uses many of the same techniques she learned in my classroom. Margaret continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each example. Michael Thompson, class of 2015, came to my classroom as a foster child with behavioral issues that had resulted in multiple suspensions. Rather than implementing the punitive measures that data-driven approaches might suggest, I worked with him to develop self-regulation strategies and found learning activities that channeled his energy productively. Michael graduated high school last year with a full scholarship to study engineering. The folder contained dozens of similar stories, each one representing a child who had been written off by others but had flourished under Margaret's patient guidance. As she read, parents throughout the room began to nod in recognition, remembering their own children's transformations, their own gratitude for a teacher who saw potential where others saw problems. Sarah Kim, class of 2012, Margaret continued, arrived in my classroom speaking virtually no English after her family immigrated from South Korea. Principal Wade's presentation criticized my failure to embrace data-driven instructional methods, but I wonder what data would have captured Sarah's need for cultural sensitivity, emotional support, and individualized language instruction. Sarah is now a sophomore at Stanford University, majoring in biochemistry. Harrison's confident expression began to falter as Margaret's catalogue of successes continued. Each example directly contradicted his portrayal of her as an ineffective educator resistant to proven methods. More damaging to his credibility, several of the students Margaret mentioned were children of school board members and community leaders present in the room that evening. Board member Patricia Williams found herself thinking about her own daughter's experience, the way Margaret had patiently worked through reading difficulties that other teachers had dismissed as laziness. The statistics Harrison had presented suddenly seemed hollow compared to the real-world impact Margaret was documenting through her students' achievements. "These are not isolated examples," Margaret said, closing her folder and looking directly at Harrison. "They represent a teaching, philosophy that recognizes each child as an individual human being with unique needs, strengths, and potential. This approach requires creativity, flexibility, and yes, sometimes resistance to one-size-fits-all solutions that reduce children to data points on a spreadsheet." The room erupted in applause, but Margaret raised her hand for silence. She was far from finished, and the most important part of her response was yet to come. The transformation that had been building within her over months of harassment was reaching its climax, and she understood that this moment required not just defense of her methods, but a complete dismantling of Harrison's authoritarian approach. "Principal Wade has accused me of resistance to innovation and failure to embrace evidence-based practices," Margaret continued, her voice taking on an edge that made Harrison shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I would like to address these charges directly because they reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what effective teaching actually requires." Margaret moved away from the podium, walking closer to where Harrison sat, her movement fluid and purposeful. Several people in the room noticed that she seemed to glide rather than walk, her footsteps silent despite the hard floor of the boardroom. The change in her demeanor was becoming impossible to ignore, as if years of careful restraint were finally being set aside. Innovation in education is not about adopting the latest administrative fad or implementing cookie-cutter programs designed by people who have never faced a classroom full of diverse learners, Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority that made even the school board members lean forward in their seats. True innovation comes from understanding that every child learns differently, that effective instruction requires constant adaptation and creativity, and that meaningful progress cannot always be measured by standardized assessments. She turned to face the school board directly, her posture straight and commanding. As for evidence-based practices, I have been collecting evidence for 37 years. Not the kind of manufactured data that can be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions, but real evidence in the form of student growth, parent satisfaction, and long-term academic success. The evidence is sitting in this room tonight. Margaret gestured toward the packed audience, many of whom were former students or parents of children she had taught. These are the people who have experienced my teaching methods firsthand. They have seen the results that cannot be captured in Principal Wade's carefully selected statistics. They know the difference between education that serves children and education that serves administrative convenience. Harrison rose from his seat, his face red with anger at having his authority challenged so publicly. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "this is exactly the kind of insubordinate attitude that makes it impossible to implement necessary reforms. Your resistance to supervision and unwillingness to follow district protocols demonstrates precisely why personnel changes are needed." The room fell silent as the two educators faced each other, the tension between them crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. Margaret looked at Harrison with the kind of calm assessment she had learned during her martial arts training, recognizing in him the familiar patterns of bullies she had encountered throughout her career. The time for patience and diplomacy had passed, and she understood that the only language Harrison would understand was strength. "Principal Wade," Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet, but carrying clearly through the silent room. "You have spent months trying to destroy my reputation, questioning my competence, and undermining my relationships with students and families. You have done this not because my methods are ineffective, but because they threaten your vision of education as a business rather than a calling." She took a step closer to Harrison, who instinctively backed away from her approach. Something in Margaret's demeanor had changed fundamentally, and even someone as obtuse as Harrison could sense that he was no longer dealing with the submissive teacher he thought he had intimidated into compliance. "You want to talk about evidence-based practices?" Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Let me share some evidence with you. In the 5 years before your arrival, Lincoln Elementary ranked in the top 10% of schools statewide for student growth and achievement. Our parent satisfaction surveys consistently showed 95% approval ratings. Our teacher retention rate was among the highest in the district." Margaret paused, letting these facts settle over the room before delivering her devastating conclusion. "In the 8 months since your arrival, we have lost 6 experienced teachers to transfers or early retirement. Parent complaints to the district office have increased by 300%. Our most recent climate survey shows that both students and staff report feeling less safe and less supported than they did before your reforms began." The assembled crowd murmured their agreement, many nodding as they recognized the decline. Margaret was describing. Harrison's face had gone pale, realizing that his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling under the weight of objective evidence he couldn't dismiss or manipulate. "But the most damning evidence," Margaret said, her voice now carrying the kind of quiet power that made everyone in the room lean forward to catch every word, "is your own behavior tonight. You have stood before this board and attempted to destroy the reputation of a teacher with nearly 4 decades of exemplary service. You have presented misleading statistics and false characterizations designed to serve your own administrative ambitions rather than the needs of our students." Margaret moved closer still to Harrison, who was now visibly sweating despite the air conditioning in the boardroom. You want to remove me because I represent everything you cannot understand about effective education. I represent relationships over regulations, creativity over compliance, wisdom over data points. Most importantly, I represent the inconvenient truth that good teaching cannot be mandated through administrative pressure or fear-based management. The transformation was complete now, and everyone in the room could see it. The quiet, patient teacher who had endured months of harassment had revealed herself to be something far more formidable. She stood before Harrison with the kind of controlled power that came from decades of disciplined training, not just in martial arts, but in the far more complex art of human development. "So let me make something very clear, Principal Wade," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her true strength after years of hiding it. "I will not be intimidated by your bullying tactics. I will not be silenced by your administrative harassment, and I will not allow you to destroy the educational environment that generations of teachers, students, and families have worked together to create." Harrison attempted to regain control of the situation, stepping toward the microphone with the bluster that had served him in previous confrontations. "Mrs. Chen, your insubordinate behavior tonight demonstrates exactly why disciplinary action is necessary. No teacher has the right to speak to their principal in this manner, regardless of their tenure or community support." But Margaret was no longer the compliant educator Harrison thought he could manipulate. She moved to intercept him, positioning herself between Harrison and the microphone with fluid grace that made it clear she had no intention of allowing him to regain control of the narrative. Her movement was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of spatial control that martial artists use to dominate confrontations without resorting to physical violence. "The only demonstration happening here tonight," Margaret said, her voice cutting through Harrison's bluster like a blade through paper, "is your complete failure to understand what education actually requires. You have confused authority with leadership, control with competence, and fear with respect. The insubordination you see in my response to your attacks is really just the natural reaction of someone who refuses to be bullied into abandoning the children who need advocates." The room erupted in applause, but Margaret held up her hand for silence. She wasn't finished with her dismantling of Harrison's credibility, and she understood that this moment might be her only opportunity to expose the full extent of his destructive leadership before he could retaliate against her or other teachers who had witnessed his abusive behavior. "Members of the school board," Margaret said, turning away from Harrison to address the panel directly, "I have documentation of Principal Wade's harassment campaign against not just myself, but several other faculty members who have dared to question his methods. I have emails, recorded conversations, and witness statements that demonstrate a pattern of intimidation designed to silence anyone who challenges his authority." She reached into her briefcase again, withdrawing a second folder that was even thicker than the first. Mrs. Linda Peterson, who taught second grade for 23 years before transferring to Wilson Elementary, documented months of harassment similar to what I have experienced. Mr. Robert Hayes, our former art teacher, was forced into early retirement after Principal Wade eliminated his program and reassigned him to custodial duties. Ms. Angela Torres, who taught ESL students with remarkable success for 15 years, was given impossible class sizes and no resources until she finally accepted a position in another district. Margaret's documentation was thorough and devastating, each example building a case for systematic abuse of power that extended far beyond her individual situation. As she read from the files, board members began to understand that Harrison's problems with Margaret were part of a larger pattern of destructive leadership that was driving away the district's most experienced and effective educators. Harrison, watched his carefully constructed facade crumbling with each revelation Margaret shared. His face had gone from red to pale to green as the full extent of his exposure became clear. The room that had begun the evening as his carefully orchestrated tribunal was transforming into his own professional execution, and the weapon being used against him was nothing more than truth and documentation he had never imagined anyone would have the courage to compile. "Principal Wade," Margaret said, turning back to face him directly, "you have made a career of intimidating people you perceive as weak or vulnerable. You have built your reputation on destroying the careers of educators who threaten your authority through their competence and community respect. Tonight, you have made the mistake of targeting someone who understands that sometimes the greatest service you can provide is to stand up and fight back." The quiet teacher who had endured months of harassment had completed her transformation into something Harrison had never encountered before, an opponent who combined the wisdom of decades in education with the disciplined strength of a trained warrior. Margaret stood before him with the kind of controlled power that made it clear the confrontation was far from over, and that his attempts to destroy her had only succeeded in awakening something he was completely unprepared to face. The silence that followed Margaret's devastating revelations stretched like a taut wire through the packed boardroom. Harrison stood frozen beside his abandoned presentation materials, his carefully constructed authority crumbling with each passing second. The school board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing understanding of the situation they had unwittingly allowed to develop under their oversight. Dr. Mitchell cleared her throat, attempting to restore some semblance of order to proceedings that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. "Mrs. Chen, these are very serious allegations you're making. Do you have documentation to support these claims about Principal Wade's conduct?" Margaret nodded calmly, her composure a stark contrast to Harrison's visible agitation. "I have 3 months of emails, Dr. Mitchell, including several where Principal Wade explicitly threatened disciplinary action against teachers who questioned his policies. I have recordings of faculty meetings where he used intimidation tactics that would be considered workplace harassment in any other professional environment. And I have written statements from 6 former faculty members who left Lincoln Elementary specifically because of his hostile management style." She opened her second folder and began placing documents on the table in front of the school board with methodical precision. Each piece of evidence was organized, labeled, and cross-referenced with the thoroughness of someone who understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. The board members leaned forward to examine the materials, their expressions growing increasingly grave as they absorbed the scope of the documentation. Harrison finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strained croak rather than his usual commanding tone. "These allegations are completely unfounded," he protested. But the conviction that had carried him through his presentation was notably absent. "Mrs. Chen is clearly attempting to deflect attention from her own performance issues by manufacturing complaints against administration. This is exactly the kind of insubordinate behavior that makes it impossible to maintain professional standards." Margaret turned to face him with the patient expression she had perfected through decades of dealing with difficult personalities. "Principal Wade, would you like me to play the recording of our conversation from February 14th when you told me that if I didn't stop questioning your policies in faculty meetings, you would find a way to make my remaining years at Lincoln Elementary very unpleasant? Or perhaps you'd prefer to hear the recording from March 2nd, when you informed me that teachers who couldn't adapt to your leadership style might find themselves facing early retirement, whether they wanted it or not." The color drained from Harrison's face as he realized the full extent of Margaret's preparation. He had never imagined that the quiet teacher he had been systematically harassing would have the foresight or courage to document his abuse. The revelation that she had been recording their conversations sent a chill through him as he tried to remember exactly what threats he might have made during what he had assumed were private intimidation sessions. Board member James Crawford held up one of the documents Margaret had provided, his expression darkening as he read, "Principal Wade, this email from your official school account states, and I quote, 'Teachers who cannot embrace the new direction of Lincoln Elementary may find that their services are no longer required, regardless of their tenure status or community connections.' Did you write this?" Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as he struggled to formulate a response that might salvage his position. The email Crawford was reading had been sent to the entire faculty as part of Harrison's campaign to establish dominance, but he had never expected it to be presented as evidence of harassment. That communication was intended to motivate professional growth and adaptation to improved educational standards. He stammered. Margaret stepped forward, her movement fluid and controlled. "Mr. Crawford, if you'll look at the date on that email, you'll notice it was sent 3 days after our faculty meeting, where I asked questions about the pedagogical research supporting Principal Wade's new assessment protocols. The timing was not coincidental." She retrieved another document from her folder, this one bearing the official letterhead of the district's Human Resources Department. "I filed a formal complaint with HR regarding Principal Wade's retaliatory behavior on March 15th. The response I received stated that my concerns would be addressed through appropriate administrative channels. As you can see from this follow-up correspondence, those channels led directly back to Principal Wade himself, who was asked to investigate his own conduct." The implications of this circular reporting structure hit the board members like a physical blow. They were beginning to understand that Harrison's behavior had not only been abusive, but had been enabled by a system that failed to provide meaningful protection for employees reporting administrative misconduct. Dr. Mitchell made a note on her legal pad, her expression suggesting that significant policy changes would be forthcoming. Harrison attempted to regain control of the narrative, moving toward the microphone with the desperation of someone whose career was disintegrating in real time. "These documents are taken completely out of context," he insisted, his voice rising with each word. "Mrs. Chen is presenting a biased interpretation of normal administrative communications and performance management procedures. Every principal has the right and responsibility to address teacher performance issues through appropriate supervisory channels." Margaret smiled with the patient expression she typically reserved for particularly challenging students. "Principal Wade, would you like to explain to the board why appropriate supervisory channels included reassigning me to 3 different grade levels in a single semester? Or why performance management required conducting surprise classroom observations specifically timed to coincide with fire drills and other disruptions? Or perhaps you could clarify how normal administrative communication justifies publicly criticizing my teaching methods in front of students and parents?" Each question landed like a precisely aimed blow, and Harrison could feel his credibility evaporating with each revelation. The assembled crowd was watching his public humiliation with the fascination of people witnessing a masterclass in professional destruction. Several teachers in the audience were taking notes, recognizing techniques they might need to use if they ever faced similar harassment campaigns. Margaret continued her systematic dismantling of Harrison's position, her voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying the kind of authority that commanded absolute attention. The board should also be aware that Principal Wade's harassment campaign has had measurable impacts on student performance and school climate. Since his arrival, disciplinary referrals have increased by 40%, not because student behavior has worsened, but because his punitive approach to education has created an atmosphere of fear and resentment. She presented another set of documents, these containing statistics that Harrison had hoped to keep buried in administrative reports that board members rarely examined closely. Parent volunteer hours have decreased by 60% as families have found the school environment unwelcoming. Our teacher retention rate has plummeted to among the lowest in the district, creating instability that directly impacts student learning. Board member Patricia Williams studied the data with the attention of someone who understood both education and business metrics. These numbers are alarming, Principal Wade. How do you explain such dramatic negative trends in such a short period? Harrison's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak that fooled no one in the room. Organizational change always involves temporary challenges as systems adapt to improved procedures. The metrics Mrs. Chen is presenting fail to account for the necessary transition period required when implementing evidence-based reforms. These short-term fluctuations are expected outcomes that will resolve as staff and families adjust to higher expectations. Margaret allowed Harrison to finish his explanation before delivering her coup de grace. Principal Wade, these are not short-term fluctuations. They are the predictable results of leadership that prioritizes control over collaboration, fear over respect, and administrative convenience over educational effectiveness. The evidence is not limited to statistics and documentation. It's sitting in this room. She gestured toward the packed audience, her movement encompassing parents, teachers and community members who had come to support her. Mrs. Rodriguez, would you please tell the board about your experience with Principal Wade when you attempted to volunteer in your daughter's classroom? Mrs. Rodriguez stood slowly, her nervousness evident but her determination clear. Principal, Wade told me that parent volunteers were disruptive to the learning environment and that my services were no longer needed. When I asked why, since I'd been volunteering for 5 years without any complaints, he said that new security protocols required extensive background checks that would take months to process. But when I contacted the district office, they told me no such protocols existed. Margaret nodded encouragingly. Mr. Thompson, would you share what happened when you requested a conference to discuss your son's individualized education plan? An elderly man in the back row cleared his throat before speaking. Principal Wade told me that IEP accommodations were being revised to align with district efficiency standards. He said my son's need for extended time on tests was actually enabling learned helplessness, and that reducing accommodations would motivate him to work harder. When I showed him documentation from my son's doctors supporting the accommodations, he said medical opinions didn't override educational expertise. The testimonies continued for nearly 20 minutes, each one revealing another aspect of Harrison's systematic campaign to remake Lincoln Elementary according to his authoritarian vision. Parents described being dismissed when they raised concerns about their children's needs. Teachers spoke about curriculum changes that ignored grade-level developmental appropriateness. Community members shared stories about programs that had been eliminated without consultation or explanation. Through it all, Harrison's confidence continued to erode. He had built his career on the assumption that individual resistance could be crushed through persistent pressure and institutional authority. He had never faced organized opposition backed by thorough documentation and community support. The quiet teacher he had targeted for elimination was proving to be far more formidable than any opponent he had previously encountered. Margaret allowed the testimonies to continue until she was satisfied that the full scope of Harrison's destructive leadership had been exposed. Then she stepped forward again, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. The transformation that had begun with her first words at the podium was now complete, revealing someone whose strength had been hidden beneath years of professional courtesy and institutional deference. Principal Wade, Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made even Harrison stop his nervous fidgeting and focus on her words. "You came to Lincoln Elementary with promises of reform and improvement. Instead, you have created an environment of fear and hostility that serves no one except your own need for control. You have driven away experienced teachers, alienated committed families, and turned a supportive learning community into an institutional battleground." She moved closer to him, her approach measured and deliberate. Harrison instinctively stepped backward, though he couldn't articulate why her proximity made him so uncomfortable. Something in Margaret's bearing suggested that the confrontation was moving beyond words into territory where his usual tactics would be useless. "You have spent months trying to destroy my reputation and eliminate my influence because you correctly identified me as the primary obstacle to your authoritarian agenda," Margaret continued, her words precise and devastating. "What you failed to understand is that my influence comes not from politics or manipulation, but from 37 years of service to children and families who needed an advocate. That foundation cannot be destroyed through administrative harassment or professional intimidation." Harrison attempted one final rally, drawing on the bluster that had carried him through previous conflicts. "Mrs. Chen, your grandstanding tonight only confirms everything I've said about your inability to accept legitimate administrative authority. This kind of public insubordination demonstrates exactly why personnel changes are necessary to restore professional standards at Lincoln Elementary." Margaret smiled with genuine amusement at Harrison's attempt to regain control. "Principal Wade, the only thing being restored tonight is accountability for administrative abuse. You have confused legitimate authority with authoritarian control, professional standards with personal intimidation, and educational leadership with institutional bullying." She reached into her briefcase one final time, withdrawing a document that made Harrison's eyes widen with recognition and fear. "This is my formal complaint filed with the State Department of Education regarding your violations of teacher tenure laws, due process requirements, and professional conduct standards. It includes all the documentation I've shared tonight, plus additional evidence of your pattern of harassment that extends beyond Lincoln Elementary to your previous positions." The room fell silent as the implications of Margaret's final revelation sank in. She had not only documented Harrison's abuse at Lincoln Elementary, but had investigated his entire career, uncovering a pattern of destructive behavior that followed him from district to district. The complaint she held represented not just a defense of her own position, but a comprehensive case for Harrison's removal from education entirely. Board Chairwoman Dr. Mitchell stood slowly, her expression grave as she processed the magnitude of the situation that had been revealed. "Principal Wade, in light of the serious allegations and substantial documentation presented tonight, I believe it's appropriate to suspend this meeting while the board conducts a thorough investigation of these matters. You will be placed on administrative leave pending completion of our review." Harrison's face went through a rapid series of color changes as the reality of his situation became clear. His carefully orchestrated attack on Margaret had not only failed, but had resulted in his own professional destruction. The quiet teacher he had dismissed as weak and ineffectual had proven to be the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. Someone who combined strategic thinking with unshakable moral courage. "This is outrageous," Harrison protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot allow one disgruntled employee to destroy an administrator's career through manufactured complaints and manipulated evidence. I demand due process and a fair hearing before any personnel actions are taken." Margaret stepped forward one final time, positioning herself directly in front of Harrison with the kind of controlled presence that made it clear she was no longer hiding any aspect of her true strength. "Principal Wade, you will receive exactly the same due process you provided to the teachers you harassed and the students you failed. You will be judged by the same standards of evidence and accountability you applied to others. The only difference is that your victims documented everything." The confrontation was over, though Harrison seemed unable to accept the finality of his defeat. He looked around the room desperately, seeking some source of support or sympathy that might salvage his position. Instead, he found faces that reflected disappointment, anger, and in some cases satisfaction at seeing a bully finally face consequences for his actions. Margaret gathered her materials with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the evening. Her documentation had served its purpose, providing the foundation for Harrison's removal and establishing precedents that would protect future teachers from similar harassment. But more importantly, her willingness to stand up and fight back had demonstrated to everyone present that institutional bullies could be defeated when their victims found the courage to resist. The veteran teacher who had walked into the boardroom as Harrison's intended victim was leaving as the architect of his professional destruction. She had shown that true strength often came disguised as patience, that wisdom could triumph over authority, and that sometimes the greatest service one could provide was to stand up and say that enough was enough. As the crowd began to disperse, dozens of people approached Margaret to offer thanks, support, and their own stories of encounters with administrative bullying. She listened to each one with the same patient attention she had always given to struggling students, understanding that her victory was meaningful only if it inspired others to find their own courage when facing institutional abuse. Harrison gathered his belongings in silence, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had finally met an opponent he could not intimidate or defeat. He would face additional investigations, legal challenges, and the end of his career in education. But perhaps most significantly, he would carry the knowledge that his downfall had been engineered by someone he had dismissed as powerless. Someone who had proven that real authority came not from position, but from character, preparation, and the willingness to fight for what was right. The weeks following Harrison's suspension brought a transformation to Lincoln Elementary that no one could have anticipated. The oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the school like a heavy blanket began to lift as teachers rediscovered their voices and students sensed the return of warmth to their learning environment. Margaret found herself at the center of changes that extended far beyond her individual victory over an abusive administrator. The state investigation into Harrison's conduct moved with surprising speed once Margaret's comprehensive documentation reached the education department. Investigators discovered that her meticulous records represented only the tip of an iceberg that included similar patterns of abuse at Harrison's 3 previous positions. Schools across 2 districts had suffered under his authoritarian approach, losing experienced teachers and alienating families who simply transferred their children rather than fight battles they assumed they couldn't win. Dr. Sarah Coleman, the veteran educator brought in as interim principal, arrived at Lincoln Elementary with the kind of collaborative leadership style that made immediate differences visible to anyone paying attention. Her first faculty meeting began not with threats or ultimatums, but with coffee, pastries, and a simple question that Harrison had never thought to ask. What do you need to do your best work for these children? Margaret watched her colleagues rediscover their professional confidence as Dr. Coleman listened to their concerns, implemented their suggestions, and trusted their expertise rather than micromanaging their every decision. Teachers who had been planning transfers suddenly withdrew their applications, The art program that Harrison had eliminated was restored within a month. Parent volunteers returned in numbers that exceeded previous years, as word spread that Lincoln Elementary was once again a welcoming place for families. The personal cost of Margaret's stand became apparent only gradually as the adrenaline of confrontation faded into the reality of aftermath. She discovered that taking on institutional bullying required emotional reserves she hadn't fully appreciated, even with her years of martial arts training to draw upon. The stress of months of harassment, followed by the intensity of her public battle with Harrison, left her feeling simultaneously victorious and exhausted. David found her in their backyard one Saturday morning, moving through her traditional forms with unusual intensity. The graceful sequences that typically brought her peace seemed tinged with an urgency that spoke to unresolved tensions beneath her calm exterior. He waited until she completed her routine before approaching, recognizing the signs of someone processing trauma through physical discipline. "You're still fighting him," David observed quietly, settling onto the bench they had installed years earlier to create a meditation space in their garden. "Even though you won." Margaret lowered her hands slowly, her breathing still controlled but deeper than usual. "I keep thinking about all the teachers who didn't fight back, all the students who suffered because good people stayed silent. Harrison wasn't the first bully I've encountered in education, and he won't be the last. I'm wondering if winning one battle is enough." The question would shape the next phase of Margaret's career in ways neither she nor David could have imagined. That morning, within 6 months, she found herself fielding calls from teachers across the state who faced similar harassment from administrators who used their positions to intimidate rather than lead. Her documentation methods became templates for others building cases against abusive supervisors. Her story became a symbol of hope for educators who had felt powerless against institutional bullying. The transformation extended beyond individual cases to systemic changes that rippled through the education community. The State Department revised its policies for investigating administrative misconduct, implementing stronger protections for teachers who reported harassment and clearer consequences for administrators who abused their authority. Margaret's case became a precedent that made it significantly more difficult for bullies like Harrison to use bureaucratic systems to silence their victims. Harrison himself seemed to vanish from the education world entirely once the full scope of his misconduct became public knowledge. The investigation revealed financial irregularities in his previous positions, inappropriate relationships with subordinates, and a pattern of retaliatory behavior that extended far beyond what Margaret had experienced. His teaching credentials were permanently revoked, and he faced civil lawsuits from multiple school districts seeking damages for the disruption his leadership had caused. Margaret received a letter from him nearly a year after the board meeting, a rambling attempt at explanation and partial apology that revealed how completely he had misunderstood both the nature of his abuse and the character of his victim. He claimed that his aggressive management style had been motivated by genuine concern for educational improvement, that his harassment of veteran teachers had been necessary to clear space for innovative approaches to learning. The letter demonstrated that even in defeat, Harrison remained incapable of acknowledging the human cost of his authoritarian approach or accepting responsibility for the damage he had inflicted on countless educators and students. Margaret read it once, then filed it away with the rest of her documentation, recognizing it as evidence of a mindset that would never truly comprehend why his methods had been both cruel and counterproductive. The real measure of Margaret's victory came not from Harrison's downfall, but from the renaissance that bloomed at Lincoln Elementary under Dr. Coleman's leadership. Test scores improved dramatically as teachers rediscovered their creativity, and students responded to the return of joy in learning. The school's climate surveys showed remarkable improvement in every category measured, from student engagement to parent satisfaction to teacher morale. More importantly, Margaret began to see the long-term impact of her stand in the faces of colleagues who had found their own courage to resist inappropriate administrative pressure. Teachers throughout the district began speaking up when they witnessed bullying behavior, knowing that Margaret's precedent had created meaningful protections for those who challenged authority when necessary. The young teachers who had watched Margaret's confrontation with Harrison carried those lessons into their own careers, understanding that strength could be demonstrated through strategic resistance rather than submission. They learned that documentation was a powerful weapon against abuse, that community support could triumph over institutional authority, and that sometimes the greatest service one could provide was to stand up and fight back. Margaret's classroom became an informal training ground for educators seeking to develop both their teaching skills and their professional resilience. She mentored young teachers in the art of patient resistance, showing them how to document inappropriate behavior, build community support, and choose their battles strategically. Her lessons extended far beyond pedagogy to include the kind of institutional survival skills that education schools rarely taught. The martial arts philosophy that had sustained Margaret through her darkest months with Harrison became integrated into her approach to teacher mentorship. She taught her protégés that true strength came from discipline rather than aggression, that the greatest victories were often achieved through restraint rather than force, and that knowing when to fight was just as important as knowing how to fight. 5 years after the board meeting that ended Harrison's career, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the State Education Conference, delivering the keynote address on educator advocacy and professional resilience. The quiet teacher who had once preferred to work behind the scenes had become a nationally recognized voice for institutional reform and teacher empowerment. Her speech focused not on her individual victory over Harrison, but on the systemic changes needed to prevent future cases of administrative abuse. She shared strategies for documenting harassment, building community coalitions, and using legal protections that many educators didn't know existed. Most importantly, she emphasized that standing up to bullies was not just a personal responsibility, but a professional obligation to the students and families who depended on schools for safety and support. The standing ovation that followed her presentation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Margaret was most moved by the conversations that followed. Teachers approached her throughout the conference to share their own stories of resistance, their victories over abusive administrators, and their gratitude for the example she had set. Many credited her courage with inspiring their own decisions to fight back rather than surrender. Margaret returned to Lincoln Elementary each day with renewed appreciation for the community she had helped preserve. The school that had once felt like a battleground had been transformed into the kind of collaborative learning environment she had always envisioned. Students thrived under teachers who felt supported and valued. Parents engaged enthusiastically with educators who welcomed their involvement. The whole school hummed with the energy that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. The locket that Margaret wore to school each day was not a family heirloom like the one in other stories, but a gift from her students following her victory over Harrison. The small silver pendant contained no photograph, but bore an inscription that captured the essence of what she had accomplished. For Mrs. Chen, who taught us that fighting for what's right is the most important lesson of all. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit in her backyard garden and reflect on the unexpected direction her career had taken. She had never imagined that her final years in education would be defined by conflict and advocacy rather than the peaceful classroom instruction she had always preferred. But she understood now that some battles were too important to avoid, that some stands were too necessary to postpone. The transformation that had begun with Harrison's harassment had revealed dimensions of her character that might otherwise have remained dormant. The quiet teacher had discovered within herself the heart of a warrior, not in the sense of someone who sought conflict, but someone who would not retreat when conflict became unavoidable. She had learned that true strength often required stepping out of comfort zones and accepting roles that felt foreign but necessary. Margaret's story became part of Lincoln Elementary's institutional memory, shared with new teachers as both inspiration and instruction. The lesson was not that all administrators were bullies or that all conflicts should escalate to public confrontations, but that dedicated educators had both the right and responsibility to resist abuse when other remedies proved inadequate. The veteran teacher who had walked into that board meeting as Harrison's intended victim had emerged as something far more significant, a symbol of the possibility that institutional bullies could be defeated, that documentation and community support could triumph over authority and intimidation, and that sometimes the quiet ones carried the deepest reserves of strength. Years later, when former students returned to visit their beloved teacher, they often mentioned not just the academic skills she had taught them, but the life lesson embedded in her confrontation with Harrison. They had learned that standing up to bullies was possible, that strength came in many forms, and that the most important battles were often fought not for personal gain, but for the protection of others who could not protect themselves. Margaret's legacy extended far beyond her individual classroom to encompass a new understanding of educator advocacy and professional courage. She had shown that teachers were not powerless victims of administrative abuse, but professionals with rights, resources, and responsibilities that included fighting back when fighting became necessary. The woman who had once preferred invisibility had become a beacon for educators facing their own institutional battles, proof that quiet strength could triumph over loud authority, that patient documentation could defeat aggressive intimidation, and that sometimes the greatest teaching happened not in classrooms, but in boardrooms, where the future of education hung in the balance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.